Chapter 25. The camp buzzed with activity as tents came down and rangers repacked their equipment and tied on their saddlebags. Already, the first few riders had departed, heading back to their own fiefs. Will was fastening the ties on their saddle packs, having replaced the few items they had taken out. Holt sat a few meters away, frowning thoughtfully as he studied a map of the area surrounding the solitary plain. The plain itself was a vast, unmapped area, with no roads and few features indicated. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up. Gillen stood there, a worried look on his face. "Holt," he said, in a low, concerned voice, "are you sure about this?" Holt met his gaze steadily. "Very sure, Gillen. It simply has to be done." "But he's only a boy," Gillen protested, looking to where Will was tying a pack-roll in place behind Tug's saddle. Holt let go a long breath, his eyes dropping from Gillen's. "I know that, but he's a ranger. Apprentice or not, he's a member of the Corps, like all of us." He saw that Gillen was about to protest further, out of concern for Will, and he felt a surge of affection for his old apprentice. "Gillen, in an ideal world, I wouldn't put him at risk like this, but this isn't an ideal world. Everybody's going to have to play a part in this campaign, even boys like Will. Morgorath is preparing for something big. Crowley's agents have got wind that, on top of everything else, he's been in touch with the Scandians." "The Scandians? What for?" Holt shrugged. "We don't know the details, but my bet is he's hoping to form an alliance with them. They'll fight anyone for money, and apparently they'll fight for anyone as well," he added, his distaste for mercenaries obvious in his voice. "The point is, we're short-handed enough while Crowley tries to raise the army. Normally, I wouldn't go after the Kalkara with a force of less than 5 senior rangers. But he simply can't spare them for me. So I've had to settle for the 2 I trust most, you and Will." Gillen grinned crookedly. "Well, thanks for that anyway." He was touched by Holt's confidence. He still looked up to his old mentor. Most of the Ranger Corps did. "Besides, I thought that rusty old sword of yours might come in handy if we run into those horrors," Holt said. The Ranger Corps had chosen very wisely when they allowed Gillen to continue his training with the weapon. Although very few people knew it, Gillen was one of the finest swordsmen in Araluen. "As for Will," Holt continued, "don't underestimate him. He's very resourceful. He's quick and brave and a damn good shot already. Best of all, he thinks quickly. My real thinking is that if we get on the trail of the Kalkara, we can send him for reinforcements. That'll help us and keep him out of harm's way." Gillen scratched his chin thoughtfully. Now that Holt had explained it, it seemed the only logical course for them to take. He met the older man's eyes and nodded his understanding of the situation. Then he turned to organize his own kit, only to find that Will had already repacked it and tied it to his saddle. He smiled at Holt. "You're right," he said. "He does think for himself." The 3 of them rode out a little while later, while the other rangers were still receiving their orders. Mobilizing the Araluen army would be no small task, and it would be the rangers' job to coordinate it, and then be ready to guide the individual forces from the 50 fiefs to their assembly point at the plains of Uthal. With both Gillen and Holt assigned to searching for the Kalkara, the other rangers had to be tasked with coordinating the forces from their fiefs as well. There was little said between the 3 companions as Holt led the way to the southeast. Even Will's natural curiosity was subdued by the magnitude of the task ahead of them. As they rode in silence, his mind's eye kept conjuring images of savage bear-like creatures with the features of apes, creatures that might well prove to be invincible, even for someone of Holt's skill. Eventually, however, as monotony set in, the horrific images receded, and he began to wonder what plan, if any, Holt had in mind. "Holt," he asked, a little breathlessly, "where do you hope to find the Kalkara?" Holt looked at the serious young face beside him. They were travelling at the Rangers' forced march pace, 40 minutes in the saddle, riding at a steady canter, then 20 minutes on foot, leading the horses and allowing them to travel unburdened, while the men ran at a steady trot. Every 4 hours, they would pause for 1 hour's rest, when they ate a quick meal of dried meat, hard bread, and fruit, then rolled into their cloaks to sleep. They had been travelling for some time now, and Holt judged that it was time to rest. He led Abelard off the road and into the shelter of a grove of trees. Will and Gillen followed, dropping the reins and allowing their horses to graze. The best way I can think of, Holt said, in answer to Will's question, is to start at their lair and see if they're in the vicinity. How do we know where that is? Gillen asked. Best intelligence we have is that it's somewhere on the solitary plain behind the stone flutes. We'll scout around that area and see what we can find. If they're in the area, we should find that the odd sheep or goat is going missing from villages nearby. Although getting the villagers themselves to talk will be another matter. Plains people are a closed-mouth bunch at the best of times. What's this plain you're talking about? Will asked, through a mouthful of hard bread. And what on earth is a stone flute? The solitary plain is a vast, flat area, very few trees, mainly covered in rock outcrops and long grass, Holt told him. The wind seems to always be blowing, no matter what time of year you go there. It's a dismal, depressing place, and the stone flutes are the most dismal part of it. But what are? Will began, but Holt had only paused briefly. The stone flutes? Nobody really knows. They're a circle of standing stones built by the ancients, smack in the middle of the windiest part of the plain. Nobody has ever worked out their original purpose, but they're arranged in such a way that the wind is deflected round the circle and through a series of holes in the stones themselves. They create a constant keening sound, although why anyone thought they sounded like flutes is beyond me. The sound is eerie and discordant, and you can hear it from kilometres away. After a few minutes, it sets your teeth on edge, and it goes on and on for hours. Will was silent. The thought of a dismal, wind-swept plain and stones that emitted a non-stop keening wail seemed to take the last vestige of warmth from the late afternoon sun. He shivered involuntarily. Holt saw the movement and leaned forward to clap him on the shoulder encouragingly. "Cheer up," he said. "Nothing's ever as bad as it sounds. Now let's get some rest." They reached the outskirts of the solitary plain by noon the second day. Holt was right, Will thought. It was a vast, depressing place. The featureless ground stretched out before them for kilometre after kilometre, covered in tall grey grass, made rank and dry by the constant wind. The wind itself almost seemed to be a living presence. It rubbed on their nerves, blowing constantly and unvaryingly from the west, bending the tall grass before it as it swept across the flat ground of the solitary plain. "Now you can see why they call it the solitary plain," Holt said to the two of them, reining Abelard in so they could come abreast of him. "When you ride out into this damned wind, you feel as if you're the only person left alive on earth." It was true, Will thought. He felt small and insignificant against the emptiness of the plain. And with the feeling of insignificance came an accompanying feeling of impotence. The wasteland they were riding across seemed to hint at the presence of arcane forces far greater than his own capabilities. Even Gillen, normally cheerful and ebullient, seemed affected by the heavy, depressing atmosphere of the place. Only Holt seemed unchanged, remaining grim and taciturn as ever. Gradually, as they rode, Will became aware of a disquieting sensation. Something was lurking, just outside the range of his conscious perception. Something that made him feel uneasy. He couldn't isolate it, couldn't even tell where it was coming from, or what form it took. It was just there, ever present. He shifted in his saddle, standing in the stirrups to scan the featureless horizon in the hope that he might see the source of it all. Holt noticed the movement. "You've noticed them," he said. "It's the stones." And now that Holt said it, Will realized that it had been a sound, so faint and so continuous that he couldn't isolate it as such, that had been creating this sense of unease in his mind, and the tight cramping of fear in the pit of his stomach. Or perhaps it was just that as Holt said it, they came into proper earshot of the stone flutes. Because now he could isolate it. It was an unmelodic series of musical notes, all being played at once but creating a harsh, discordant sound that jangled the nerves and unsettled the mind. His left hand crept unobtrusively to the hilt of his sax knife as he rode, and he drew comfort from the solid, dependable touch of the weapon. They went on through the afternoon, never seeming to advance across the empty, featureless plain. With each pace, the horizons behind and before them seemed to neither recede nor draw closer. It was as if they were marking time in the empty world. The constant keening sound of the stone flutes was with them all day, growing gradually stronger as they travelled. It was the only sign that they were making progress. Hours passed and the sound continued, and Will found it no easier to bear. It wore at his nerves, keeping him constantly on edge. As the sun began to sink at the western rim, Holt reined Abelard in. "We'll rest for the night," he announced. "It's almost impossible to maintain a constant course in the dark. Without any significant land features to set a course by, we could easily wind up going around in circles." Gratefully, the others dismounted. Fit as they were, the hours spent at a forced march pace had left them bone-weary. Will began scouting around the few stunted bushes that grew on the plain, searching for firewood. Holt, realizing what was in his mind, shook his head. "No fire," he said. "We'd be visible for miles, and we have no idea who might be watching." Will paused, letting the small bundle he had gathered fall to the ground. "You mean the Kalkara?" he said. Holt shrugged. "Them, or Plains people. We can't be sure that some of them aren't in league with the Kalkara. After all, living cheek by jowl with creatures like that, you might well end up cooperating with them, just to ensure your own safety. And we don't want them getting word that there are strangers in the plain." Gillen was unsaddling Blaze, his bay horse. He dropped the saddle to the ground and rubbed the horse down with a handful of the ever-present dry grass. "You don't think we've been seen already?" he asked. Holt considered the question for a few seconds before answering. "We might have been. There are just too many unknowns here, like where the Kalkara actually have their lair, whether or not the Plains people are their allies, whether or not any of them have seen us and reported our presence. But until I know we have been seen, we'll assume we haven't. So no fire." Gillen nodded reluctantly. "You're right, of course," he said. "It's just I'd happily kill someone for a cup of coffee." "Light a fire to brew it," Holt told him, "and you might end up having to do just that."